And for more details on this breaking story, let's cross live to journalist Sam Husseini. Sam, welcome to the program. Israel says that it's killed Iran's Supreme National Security Council Secretary, Ali Larijani, in an overnight attack. What are your thoughts on this latest development?
Well, on the one hand, we see several indications that Iran has a fairly deep bench able to pull together various plans and continue the general cohesion of their resistance and efforts to retaliate against the U.S. and Israeli governments. On the other hand, we should recall that, in his first term, Trump assassinated Soleimani, the Iranian general. And, as someone fairly familiar with Palestinian history, you have to bear in mind that Israel was able to assassinate a whole series of competent Palestinian leaders throughout the 70s and 80s. Which helped result in the capitulation of the PLO with Yasser Arafat and the Oslo Accords, which led part of a general capitulation of so-called Arab rulers. So one has to be concerned about the long-term effects of assassinations of parts of the competent leadership that may exist in Iran.
And negotiations seem to be off the table now, in 18 days of war and counting. How do you think Iran will respond to this and other targeted assassinations?
Well, I mean, Israel and the United States have been doing targeted assassinations, and this is an escalation of that. I expect that Iran has said that they are not interested in negotiations at this point. Negotiations is what got us into this. The U.S. government continuously pretended to be engaging in good faith negotiations and simply used them as a pretext for attacks, as Israel did against the Palestinians last year. So I expect that Iran will continue to retaliate against U.S. and Israeli targets in the region. They've had some success in that. I think it's exposed the Arab regimes as being largely playthings of the U.S. and Israeli establishment, so that could have domestic repercussions in some of those countries. That's one effect. Another highly dangerous effect is they're being successful in terms of striking Israel, and we don't know how successful they've been in terms of striking Israel, given the restrictions by the Israeli government in terms of information, is that it is conceivable, and I wrote an article about this about a week ago, that this is part of a U.S.-Israeli plan in order to use Israel's vulnerability in a war of aggression that it started as a pretext to escalate and use its nuclear weapons. Now, Israel has used its nuclear weapons to threaten everybody in the region, and indeed the United States, into backing it in the past, probably over the last couple of years, and as documented during the 1973 war, when it was short on supplies, it basically told the United States government that if you don't back us to the hilt, we're getting ready to use our nuclear weapons. So that could be part of the dynamic here, except it might not just simply be a matter of getting the provisions that Israel demands. It could be a matter of Israel effectively wanting to have a pretext of actually detonating a nuclear weapon against Iran. It's far enough away that they might think that it wouldn't impact them. They could even be positioning Trump to do such a deranged thing. I think it's difficult to put anything beyond the moral derangement of the U.S. and Israeli governments right now.
And you've mentioned the Arab states there in the region. What do you think about that situation with them? Is Iran able to convince them to kick America out of the region, or will some join the fight against Iran, do you think?
Well, certainly there are some extremely sectarian governments that are proxies of the United States. There's the divide between the Arab people and the Arab governments. You have to recall, of course, that any Arab government that so much as looked at the United States in the wrong way, be it Iraq or Syria or Libya or whoever, got decapitated. So we have to be very careful when we say Arab governments and Arab leaders and Arab representatives. This is why I must take exception with some of the statements by the Russian government. For example, when this so-called phony Board of Peace thing was created by Trump, the Russian and Chinese governments voted to abstain rather than to veto it at the Security Council, as they obviously should have. And their statements by some Russian officials were that the Arabs told us not to. Well, this is a ridiculous statement to cite these quislings of the United States as representatives of the Arabs after any independent Arab governments have been decapitated, including, for example, Iraq was decapitated with the acquiescence of the Chinese and Russian governments, with the UN Security Council resolution cover in years past. So the current state of abysmal subjugation of the Arab governments is certainly many Arabs are culpable in that, but so are the Chinese and Russian and other governments for having failed to prevent U.S. aggression against Iraq and other governments.
And Trump has continued to call for a regime change in Iran. But as we've seen, when Israel and the U.S. assassinate one patriot in Iran, it just creates more patriots. Do you think Trump expected this conflict to last so long? What might be his plan?
Well, I believe that Trump is basically a front man for a very sophisticated establishment who's able to be a salesman and manipulate much of the U.S. public. Last September, you had Petro of Colombia talk about using Uniting for Peace, a mechanism at the UN General Assembly in order to genuinely confront Israel, and he failed to do that. He failed to introduce a resolution. He was talking about a peace force. It could also be used for sanctions against Israel. I believe that the failure to do that, to use the legal mechanisms to confront the U.S. and Israel, has led to further aggression, obviously against Iran, but also against Venezuela, against Cuba, and potentially elsewhere. You have Rubio openly calling for a new colonialism, a new imperialism. So I believe that the U.S. establishment, Trump is a salesman again. He's reading cue cards. The U.S. establishment is a very sophisticated operation. It wants potentially the Iranians and the Arab quisling regimes to be lobbing missiles at each other. It wants Israel to gain primacy. That's the axis of imperialism between the U.S. and Israel, that becomes the dominant force, as it's been, especially since Israel acquired nuclear weapons. It was very funny in your setup piece, your colleague talked about the recently assassinated leader as coming from a prominent family, akin to the Kennedy family. If you go back and look, JFK, in the months prior to his assassination, was desperately trying to stop Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons. And Israel was doing everything that it could to ensure that eventuality. So there's actually substantial case that Israel was at the very least, part of the mechanisms of even the assassination of JFK, and that helped it acquire nuclear weapons. It had a hard deadline in 1963 that Kennedy be gotten out of the way. Other forces might have wanted Kennedy out, but they didn't have the hard deadline that Israel did.
That is quite an interesting angle to that whole story. But returning to Iran, though, and its economic and political influence, obviously it does have quite a lot of influence on regional trade and stability. But do you think this will ever force the U.S. and Israel to end the onslaught?
It should if they were, minimally reasonable actors, but they will attempt to use whatever leverage they have in order to undermine the mechanisms that Iran might utilize. For example, they did regime change in Venezuela first, so that they effectively have a line into oil from Venezuela prior to taking on Iran. This indicates a sophisticated plan. They could well use Iran's blocking of the Straits of Hormuz, which is an obviously very reasonable retaliatory mechanism that Iran is utilizing in order to try to pressure China and others, and as Trump is trying to do now, and he's not succeeding in the short term in terms of getting European and other support. But we've seen this script before. I mean, time and time again, many people mock U.S. leaders, whether it's Bush or now Trump, but for their stated goals not coming to fruition. But I believe that their stated goals are not their actual goals. In Iraq, for example, the U.S. goal was never the stated goal of bringing democracy to Iraq. That was laughable. In terms of the different options that the U.S. establishment has, having a failed state in countries which might become independent, whether that's Iraq or Iran or Syria or Libya, having a failed state, it may be the most preferred option. So I believe that parts of the U.S. establishment are thinking in those terms, and they'll attempt to profit in whatever ways they can over the resistance that Iran poses. Much has been made, for example, of how costly the U.S. defense against Iran's retaliation is. But that's not really a cost to the U.S. establishment. It's simply another pretext by which they can tax the U.S. taxpayer to profit the military-industrial complex. So I think we have to assess things in starkly realistic terms.
Journalist Sam Husseini, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on this.
Thank you.